So thanks everyone for joining today and for attending the session. Really sorry I can't be there in person. Much love to all of my BITS friends and faculty. Really love the RT2 and really excited to be here today virtually to talk about the Transparency and Openness Promotion, or TOP guidelines. So for those of you who aren't familiar, these were published in Science in 2015, and they were created by researchers, journals, funders, and societies to align our scientific ideals with scientific practice. So a lot of what Ted just covered in the opening talk, and Ted was actually one of the original developers of the TOP guidelines. And they've become a recognized standard in publishing and funding over the last decade or so, and a widely used tool for promoting the implementation of open science policies at journals in particular. And there are about 5,000 or so journals and organizations who have signed on to express their interest in the guidelines and to support the principles of openness, transparency, and reproducibility. I'm really honored this year to be the chair of the advisory board for the TOP guidelines. So in addition to giving you an overview of what they entail, I'll also end with some of the things that are on the priority list for our strategic plan over the next year or two, and welcome either comments or questions today or opportunities to get engaged after RT2. So what are the TOP guidelines? They essentially involve 8 modular standards, each with different levels of increasing stringency that a journal could implement. So there are standards on sharing and citing your data. So not only citing our reports, but also citing the data sets, the code, the material that we've used to create incentives for sharing these things. And so they get counted in citation metrics, which for better or worse are still something that is important for one's scientific career, for hiring, promotion, and tenure. And so we want to see other objects that come out of the scientific process to get cited and rewarded for their sharing. There are also standards related to sharing the data, code, and materials that underlie your study. There are standards for using reporting guidelines for transparently describing what you did and what you found in a journal article or other report on your research. I'm starting to hear a little feedback again, FYI, hopefully not on your end. There are standards on prospectively registering your studies in advance and for registering your analysis plans in advance. And then there are standards related to replication studies, so studies that try to, with a new sample, follow the methods of a previous study and see whether they find the same results, and if those results differ, trying to understand what might be explaining substantively those differences in results. And then in addition to there being these standards, there are different levels at which a journal can implement those standards, again, of increasing stringency. And so while this isn't exactly how the standards fall out or the tiers fall out for each standard, as sort of a mnemonic, level 1 implementation of a standard according to TOP would be requiring folks to disclose whether or not, for example, they have shared their data. Then there's the actual requirement for the process itself, so requiring folks to share their data if you're publishing with the journal. And then the highest level of implementation is saying that the journal is going to require third-party verification that, for example, your data have been shared according to standards in their field. That could be the journal themselves serving as the third party who is verifying that the results are computationally reproducible using the data that have been shared, or perhaps it's a completely different organization that specializes in computational reproducibility, maybe through the BITS social science reproduction platform, which I imagine you'll learn about this week. And if that's been done, then you could be awarded as eligible for TOP 3. And so the point of this kind of framework is to allow journals the ability to pick which standards they want to take on board at a given point in time, and then for each of those standards to pick that level of implementation. So the hope is that this flexibility allows journals to dip their toes in the water if they're new to this, and maybe just require level 1, so just asking folks to disclose whether or not they practice open science. And then that could serve as the floor in the future for increasingly stringent implementation of a standard. It seems like our authors have responded well. Data sharing is becoming more normative. We've already got processes in place to collect information about whether data or not are shared. Maybe we're ready to require this now in a few years' time. So that's the hope with the guidelines. It can be tailored, and it also allows folks to try this out rather than going into the deep end, requiring and verifying everything at the bat. So I next want to just give you a quick glance at what each of these standards are. And I think it'd be interesting when I'm done to not only talk about how you think journals in your field are ready or not to implement these levels, but whether you yourself as a researcher, where would you fall? Would you be ready if journals in your field went level 1, 2, or 3? And we can have a discussion about really aligning our practice with the principles that Ted went over in his first talk. So as I mentioned, there are 2 standards related to prospectively registering your studies with the methods in your protocol in a registry like the American Economic Association's registry for randomized trials, or for those of you in aging research, you might be familiar with clinicaltrials.gov and NIH's policy for requiring trial registration if you're conducting a study to evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention that's funded by NIH. And then there's also a standard to not only register your study in advance, but to also register a specific analysis plan so that we know in advance what your confirmatory hypotheses were and how you plan to analyze them, in the hope that these practices could help prevent some of the selective reporting and publication biases that are really motivating a lot of the open science movement. So level 0, the journal says nothing. That would mean that you don't get any kind of credit or recognition from the top guidelines. Level 1 journals are those that require articles to state whether or not a study and an analysis plan have been registered, and if that registration exists, where to access it. So the permanent identifier, like a study registration number on clinicaltrials.gov, or perhaps even the link to the entry on clinicaltrials.gov. At level 2, the article states whether this exists, and if so, it allows journals access during peer review for verification. So level 2 journals actually incorporate registration into their review of articles, and that can factor into publication decisions. And then level 3 requires registration of studies. So to be eligible for submission in a journal, you have to have prospectively registered your study and or your analysis plan. Then there are 3 standards related to sharing one's data, code, and materials. So this, for running with the clinical trial example, the data could be the actual data underlying the results, whether you saw improvements or not on your primary outcome in your clinical trial. The code would be the statistical code in R or Stata, whatever program you use to analyze that data to get the results you're reporting in an article. And the materials could be digital copies of the questionnaires that were used to collect the data that you've analyzed. And so level 0 journal doesn't really say anything about sharing any of these things. Maybe they encourage it, but there are no requirements to disclose whether or not these have been shared. A level 1 journal requires authors to disclose whether or not these are available, the data, code, and or materials, and for any that are available, like with the study registration, where they can be accessed. So what's the permanent identifier? Where is a permanent link to find these things online in a public repository? A level 2 journal requires these things, data, code, and or materials, to be posted to a trusted repository. There usually are exceptions laid out in a journal policy. There will be legal reasons, there will be ethical reasons, there will be proprietary reasons why one can't share data, for example. That's okay, so long as those are in the policy and then those are identified at the point of article submission. So as open as possible, as closed as necessary, is tried to be baked into these guidelines. And then level 3 journals actually take this requirement a step further and say that we at the journal or another group that we trust will actually try to reproduce the reported analyses in the manuscript before this is published. And so that's the highest level where a journal or a third party is investing resources into verifying that the sharing was done to a sufficient standard, namely reproduction of the results that are reported in the article. There is a standard asking folks to cite these things. It's called data citation, but if you look at the guidance, they also talk about citing code that's shared in a repository, or citing materials like questionnaires that were shared in a repository as well. So level 0 journal doesn't mention citation of data, or any of these other outputs besides articles at all. A level 1 journal provides guidelines to authors on how to cite data. Level 2 journals provide appropriate citation for data and materials that are consistent with the journal's author guidelines. So they stated as a requirement, we not only are giving you a format for how to cite the data sets underlying your results, but we actually require you to cite this. And then level 3 is saying we are actually going to invest resources, either the time of our editorial staff, the time of the journal production staff, the publisher staff, to ensure that the citation has been done appropriately. For example, with the DOI or other persistent identifier that would get caught by Google Scholar, so that these things are getting cited and can be added to one's profiles on websites like Google Scholar. And if you haven't done that, we won't publish the article until you do. Then there's a standard on transparent reporting and disclosure. This is essentially following standards for reporting your studies. And I think you have a session or two this week on reporting guidelines. So these are checklists that tell you, for example, at a randomized trial, there's a consort checklist that tells you what we want you to report in the introduction section, the methods section, the results section, and the discussion section, so that we know what you did, what you found. We as the reader can critically appraise your study. We can understand to whom and under what conditions your results are generalizable. And that really helps with the openness of the narrative and the information that we need as scientists to appraise and use research. So level 0 journals do not articulate any reporting standards or reference any formal reporting guidelines. A level 1 journal and their journal policies, their instructions to authors, articulate design transparency standards. So at a health journal, this might be saying, please use Prisma if you're doing a systematic review. Please use Consort if you're doing a randomized trial. Level 2 journals take that a step further and say, we require you to use Consort for trials. We require you to use Prisma for systematic reviews. And level 3 journals are those that have explicit processes. They explicitly say, we're going to enforce this. So you have to submit a completed checklist with your manuscript. The peer reviewers and the editors will make sure that each item in the checklist is reported in your manuscript. If things are missing, we're going to ask for that information, and your article can't be published until that checklist is complete and that information is in your manuscript. And then the last standard in the original top guidelines was related to replication. And so the goal here is to try and create in journal policies explicit language that welcomes or encourages replication, if not dedicated submission formats or submission types for replication, as historically and really even currently, replications aren't always seen as valid or useful or prestigious of an output for a scientific career as an original study. And so that leads to a proliferation of original study after original study with no studies verifying in a new sample whether a finding is robust, whether it replicates, and to then explore moderators of effects, get a good sense of generalizability, which is important for trusting our findings and for building theory. So level 0 journals discourage submission of replication studies or say nothing. This is actually something where when this was created, they saw language actually discouraging this kind of a submission or saying we won't take them here. So they wanted to capture that in the level 0 as well. A level 1 journal explicitly encourages replication studies. So the journal in their manuscript submission guidelines or instructions to authors will say something like, explicitly, we welcome replication studies here. We're not going to reject a study simply because it's replication. It'll be given equal footing as an original study. A level 2 journal says we not only encourage or welcome replication studies, but we first want to conduct what's sometimes called results blind review, where you first submit to us the introduction and the methods section of your article. We do a peer review just on those 2 sections, and we compare the methods of your replication study to the original study to confirm whether or not we think it's a fair test, a fair replication. And then if you get a green light at that stage, then we ask you to send us the results and discussion section as well. And so then hopefully this prevents folks feeling the pressure or need to create a certain narrative with the results of the study to get accepted. If the peer reviewers and the editors say, we think it's a great question, we think the methods are sound, we think you've appropriately executed them, we do think that this is an a fair replication test of the original finding, then we just want to know what you found. And whether those are null results or negative results, confirmatory, disconfirmatory results, that's not a criterion for acceptance. It's the quality of the question and the quality of the methods and the appropriateness of those methods to answer the question. Then level 3 takes that one step further as a registered report format. I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with this. I think this might come up a lot this week, but what registered reports does is it takes that results blind review, but it actually does it in 2 completely different stages of your research lifecycle. Namely, before you actually start recruiting participants and collecting data for your replication study, you submit that protocol to the journal. And if the journal gives you in principle acceptance of the protocol, they accept your protocol before you conduct your study and say, so long as you adhere to what we've approved here, or if you have to make changes once you conduct your study, you transparently describe what those are, and we agree that they're valid, logical, then we will accept the results, whatever you find. And it splits that up in 2 stages. And so this, again, not only helps address issues related to selective reporting, because you're not being chosen for publication based on the story or your results, you're being chosen based off of the importance of the question and the methodological rigor. Another benefit of this is that you're getting feedback before you've collected the data, before you've done the study, and so it could actually be helpful. So instead of there being this sometimes adversarial relationship between you and reviewer 2, who's asking you to do all these things that you can't do, the study's done, I have to get on to the next one, you might welcome that feedback at this stage because you actually have the ability to incorporate that feedback into your study design and execution. And so then a few years after TOP was developed, the Center for Open Science, who runs the TOP Guidelines Initiative, created what they call the TOP factor. And the TOP factor is intended to be a metric that is an alternative to assessing journal quality, essentially an alternative to the impact factor, which counts up how many times articles have been cited, the average number of citations for an article in their journal over the last 2 years or 5 years, depending on which metric you use. And it says, why don't we have a metric that's not on that kind of outcome and the perverse incentives that that can generate to, publish things that get a lot of citations rather than publish high quality work, which are not always the same thing. Why don't we have metrics that measure the quality of the structure and processes of a journal? So giving journals credit for doing things like promoting research transparency, openness, and reproducibility. And so they took those 8 standards and there are 3 levels of implementation and essentially created a score. So if you're level 1 on one standard, you have a score of 1. If you're a level 2 on one standard, you're a score of 2. If you're a level 1 on all 8 standards, you have a score of 8. That's essentially how the scale works. And so the higher your score on the TOP factor, the more standards your journal is implementing at higher levels of stringency of implementation. And for those who are curious, topfactor.org is the open database where all of the journals that they've assessed to date you can look at. You can search by overall score. You can search by particular standard. You can search within your discipline. You could search by different publishers, or if you are a member of a research society that has multiple journals, you can look at all of the journals in that society. It's a living database. The data are freely available on the Open Science Framework. The evaluation rubrics are available, and they take submissions from folks who have appraised a journal not on this list. So if you go in there and a journal that you're an editorial board member of, that you submit to, that's big in your field, if they're missing from this database, you can assess them according to the public rubric and submit your assessment to the Center for Open Science. They'll take a look at it, and if they agree, then you have contributed to the database, you've added another journal there. Now, one thing to note that in addition to the 8 standards that were in the original TOP guidelines, the Center for Open Science added 2 additional standards for the TOP factor. So one is rewarding journals for implementing what they call open science badges. And these are badges that a journal can award to a given article to indicate that that article has shared their data, shared their materials, or registered their study according to standards. And the goal here is to create an incentive for doing these things, to signal to the readers that this content's available, and by making these kinds of practices more visible, in the hopes that they become more normative as a result. And then they also added an additional standard related to registered reports and publication bias, not for replication studies, but for original studies. So thinking that, hey, those kinds of encouragements of null results or negative results and having results blind review or registered reports, that's not just useful for replication studies, that's useful for any study. And so we want to add a standard to that. So what does this look like? For open science badges, if a journal doesn't offer any badges, they're level 0. If they offer 1 or 2 badges, they're level 1. And if they offer level 2, they get all 3. Don't ask me why it's not 1 badge, 2 badge, 3 badge. That made sense to me. Given that feedback, I'll let you know if and when that changes. But for whatever reason, for now, 1 or 2 badges is 1 point, 3 badges is 2 points. And then they've also added this standard that's very similar to replication studies, but it's now for just an original study. So a level 1 journal states explicitly that the significance or novelty of your results are not a criteria for publication. We're going to assess the importance of the question, the appropriateness of the method that you've proposed, and then the execution of that method. And if all those things are great, then we want to know, did you find positive results, null results, negative results, mixed results? We want to know. That's good for science. And then level 2 and level 3 are the same as replication studies, results blind review, and registered reports. But again, it's not for a replication study, it's for an original study. And then the link down there below, if you go to the Top Factor website, they also flag this, but that link gives you the wiki on the Open Science Framework where they go into very specific detail, the criteria for meeting each of the levels for each of the 10 standards in the Top Factor. So if you go to the slides that are in the Google Drive that you all have for this week, the link's there, and feel free to do a deep dive if you're really interested in how TOP has operationalized these scientific ideals of open science into actual scientific practice. The goal of the Top Factor, who can use it? One, as an author, you can use this to know what to expect or to choose where to submit. So if you have a journal in mind, you can see if these things are expected now. So if you haven't been practicing open science, now's a good time, both with having a journal that encourages it and being an RT2, to figure out, all right, these are the practices that I really want to get under my belt this week because they're becoming normal in my field. Or conversely, if you already have bought into the open science movement and you're an advocate, you can find journals that are aligned with your values and say, I'm going to submit here because they are promoting TOP, they're promoting open science, and I might hold off on submitting to these other journals until they do. Editors can use this to find best practices from peer journals or from journals in other disciplines, just to get a sense of what others are doing and how they're implementing these things. Reviewers can use these if you've been asked to review for a journal to see whether or not you might be expected to check for things like computational reproducibility. As a reader in your area, if there's a journal in your field that's influential or one that's published by your research society, you can see what steps journals in your field are taking. And if you feel like your society, your journal, your field might be behind the curve after this week, this can give you data to hopefully empower advocacy for journals in your field to take on open science policies. Publishers, I think, are starting to use this to compare steps that are being taken across communities, as well as by competitor publishers. And so you're starting to see some of these things taken up by some of the big publishers, as well as some nonprofit publishers that are helping research societies. And then funders can use this if they want to encourage submission to journals that are making progress toward open science. They can say, please go to this website, look for journals that have these kinds of requirements. Those are things that we really are valuing now, and we're actually putting money behind. And so what I wanted to end with today, as you might be curious now, cool to see this conceptual framework, cool to see these standards and how they're implemented. How do I evaluate whether my journal or a journal in my field is implementing the TOP guidelines? And if so, what's their TOP factor score? What standards are they implementing and to what degree? And so I provided in the slides there a link to a paper that my colleague Evan Mayo Wilson at UNC and I wrote as part of a series of projects funded by Arnold Ventures to try to implement and operationalize and get the take-up of open science in disciplines that are really influential in evidence-based policy, essentially disciplines that do randomized trials of social programs and health interventions where these trials are used at the federal level to determine what kinds of social programs we fund in our healthcare systems, in our educational systems, in our criminal legal systems, et cetera. So we wanted to assess, how well journals who are supplying this research to folks who run these evidence clearinghouses that review the literature, how well are these journals implementing open science standards? To do that, we realized there was kind of a gap in an actual explicit, systematic, replicable method for assessing journals according to the top standards. So following best practices and systematic reviews, we came up with this process where you first define, which journal or journals are eligible or of interest to you. And then you search for journal policies, procedures, and practices. I'll get in a second to what we mean by that. Then we developed our own instruments for collecting information from journal policies that are then fed into an algorithm to tell you which level your journal is at. Historically, the Center for Open Science Tools just said, read their policies and tell us whether it's a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3. We think it's easier to break up the criteria for each level, ask whether those are criteria are met, apologies, ask whether those criteria are met, and then if they are, the tool, the algorithm tells you what level that is. And then we provide our code in our OSF project file, which I'll get to in a second, that you could use to analyze the data that you've got to tell you what the scores are at the journal or journals you looked into. And then you want to disseminate your findings either through the top factor database, which we've submitted our assessments to, and there are increasing number of research groups, including ourselves, who are publishing manuscripts in journals in our fields as a meta-research study saying, here's where our field is right now, according to these standards, and to put that out there in the actual peer-reviewed scientific literature and to have what you're doing seen and valued as research for your hiring, promotion, and tenure purposes. So like I mentioned, once you've defined your journal or journals of interest, then you want to start getting information from those journals on their policies, procedures, and practices. And what we mean by that, if you're familiar, for those of you who work in healthcare research, with the Donabedian model for assessing the quality of healthcare organizations and systems, is we're trying to look at aspects of the structure of journals, the processes that they implement, and then what that yields, the outcomes that result. So from our point of view, that's the policies or the instructions to authors, the submission guidelines that a journal has. Those are the things that TOP historically is focused on. But then we also added, if they say in their policy that they require something, but then you actually don't see fields in the submission systems to ask for a study registration number, ask whether you've shared data, then you're not going to really see the practice move that much. So we wanted to assess whether submission systems included this information. And then if you get to the published articles, if there aren't dedicated sections in an article template for making these kinds of open research statements or open science disclosures, even if you have a policy, even if you have the submission system having fields to collect that information, you're still likely to see leakage from that process to the outcome stage. So we also assess whether the article templates in a journal have dedicated sections for reporting this information. Then, like I mentioned, we created our own rating instruments, and those are links to each of the instruments for policies, procedures, and practices at the bottom there, where you can go question by question, and each question is a yes or no, single-barreled question that hopefully is as objective as possible, knowing at the end of the day, we all make subjective decisions and whether criteria are met or not, but trying to really break down into individual, simple yes or no questions. Did the policy say this, yes or no? Did the submission system contain this, yes or no? Did the article template contain this, yes or no? And then based on your yes or no questions, there's display logic for follow-up questions. And when you're done answering all the questions for a given standard, it tells you whether a journal is level 0, level 1, level 2, level 3. So 2 examples, you could either use this as a meta-research study to evaluate an entire field. Hot off the presses at Prevention Science is the work that we did to assess the 300 plus journals that we have identified as being used to inform evidence-based policy, really the designation of evidence-based programs that are eligible for federal funding across various social sectors. And we first looked at the top factor score. So what policies do these journals have in place? We found that most have none. So we're at a fairly low baseline in our area, and we think that's really important given the high stakes of the credibility of these articles for public funding of programs and policies in the real world. And then we also looked at, if you can see over here, the degree to which a journal policy, what they say in their manuscript submission systems, is aligned with what they do, or sorry, what they say in their manuscript submission guidelines is aligned with the fields in their manuscript submission systems. So what level you are in the policies, and then whether you have an optional or required field in your submission system to provide information about study registration. And then same with the article template. If you're level 0, 1, 2, or 3 journal for study registration, do you or do you not have a dedicated article template section for providing information about study registration? And that gives us a sense of the quality of the overall process and outcome of the journal, in addition to the structure of the journal or the journal policies. So if you want to take a look at that paper, that's an example of how you can use this for an overall field. You can also do this to evaluate a single journal. So I am the methodological transparency editor for a journal called DRE, the Journal of Research on Educational Effectiveness. It's one of these journals that publishes a lot of randomized trials on educational interventions that feed into how and what programs we fund in our educational systems. And so they created my position. I applied for it, got it, and they said, we'd love for you to revamp our policies related to open science. So I took our tools from our project, assessed the policies as they stood, provided that assessment as feedback to our editorial board. Everyone agreed that we're ready to go level 1 for all of the standards. So the journal isn't ready to require practices, but they are ready to require disclosure of whether or not an open science practice was done. And they're ready to encourage things like replication and to explicitly say, it's not about the results, it's about the rigor of the study. That's what we choose articles for inclusion in our journal based off of. And then we revise the instruction authors to reflect that. We couldn't, through our publisher, make changes to our submission system. I wanted to have tidy data, right? A single field for each piece of information, because that'd be great and really cool to get an Excel sheet at the end of the year with all of that data to do some meta research and auditing of the journal. We couldn't make that change, but what they could do for us was allow us to require a document that we call our top guidelines disclosure form, and authors have to fill out this form before acceptance so that we know whether or not they have done things like register their study, share their data, etc. And then we were able to change our article template so that there is a dedicated section for the open science badges, as well as a dedicated section for open research statements, where the information they provide in the disclosure form gets carried forward into the article template. And then I, as the methods transparency editor, have a role in different steps of the production process to make sure this information is collected, submitted to the publisher, and accurately put into the typeset version. And then what I really like is that these statements and the scholarship are in front of the paywall. So even if you don't subscribe to the journal, you see these statements when you go to the title and abstract page of an article. So if there are data, there are code, there are materials, there is a registration, you see the link there and you can go and look at those things. So happy to talk to anybody who's keen to hear how that process went. And so that tees up my last slide. If you want to get involved, please get in touch. I welcome, and we all welcome at the TOP Advisory Board and Center for Open Science. If you're interested in implementing TOP at your journal, either if you're an editor or you're in the field, get in touch. If you have materials that you want us to highlight on how you've implemented open science standards, let us know. If there are journals that are missing in top factor, or you think journals that have inaccurate data, maybe the journal has updated its standards since it was assessed, get in touch to correct the top factor database. We're starting to explore this year official versions of top, not only for journals, but for other groups like funders or universities and the promotion and tenure guidelines. So if you have ideas for that, please get in touch. And then the main thing we're working on is feedback on the standards and the levels themselves, the criteria that we use to say whether someone's met those standards, and the language in our guidance to update top, because it's been almost a decade. And to Ted's note at the end of his last talk, a lot has changed in the last decade, thanks to groups like BITS and their RT2 training. And so it might be time to have a top 2.0. So if you're keen on any of those things, please get in touch. I think we have about like 5 minutes for questions before the next session. So if there's anything now, I'm happy to take it. Thanks so much for your time and have a great time this week. I'm very, very jealous that I'm not there and you are. It's a great week.